Simon think he was? Did he think he was an incarnation of his Christos Jesus, in some sense? Did he think of himself as a humble human worshiper, or a prophet, or some kind of Messiah?
Impossible to know, though there are hints of all those things. Hugh Schoenfield, who wrote The Passover Plot and many other even more fascinating books, he said, he wrote a book about Paul called The Jew of Tarsus, and in it he said he thinks Paul thought he was the Messiah at first, but then encountered Christianity and said, no, it's not me, it's him. Which is not implausible, because there's a parallel ready to hand in the case of the Unification Church. The head of the seminary for a long time up there was Reverend David Kim, and he started out thinking he was the promised Messiah, because in Korea there were these interesting syncretistic Pentecostal syncretistic movements, Korean folklore and stuff, and they believed that a Korean Messiah would soon appear, and Kim thought it was he. But then when he met Reverend Moon, he said, no, this guy's it, not me. It's just like John the Baptist. He says, I'm just happy to recognize the voice of the bridegroom. I don't have to be the bridegroom. And so he joined up. And it's not unlikely that Paul thought that. And I would say there's even hints, though that's all they are, within the New Testament that other people thought so too. Like this famous thing that got Bauer started, this thing in 1 Corinthians. I hear that some of you say, I am of Paul, I am of Cephas, I am of Apollos, I am of Christ. Well, is Christ divided? That's a very strange menu. And Bauer, I think, kind of wimped out and said that, well, the Christ faction was probably pretty much the same as the Cephas faction. It must have been Jewish Christian. I don't buy that. The far more radical inference is that Christ and the others were on the same par. There were a whole bunch of different saviors, and and when you look at the apostolic Acts, the apocryphal ones, the apostles look amazingly like Christ. They in every one of the major ones, Christ appears to people in the physical guise of the apostle, and similarly, the apostle is sooner or later taken for Christ, and something's going on there. And the parallels are amazing. Like Paul stands trial before Nero. He's executed. He immediately rises from the dead, walks back into the throne room and says to Nero, you're next, buddy, basically. And then he disappears, and his disciples go to his tomb and find it empty with incandescent light around the thing, and then they see him ascend to heaven. I mean, if that's the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, that's a little close. And there are similar ones, though that's probably the closest, but various other ones.
What writing was this in?
That one's in the Acts of Paul.
Okay.
There's several, the Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul, Acts of Thomas, Acts of John, Acts of Andrew, and later ones, Acts of Philip, and so forth. I wrote a good bit about that in Amazing Colossal Apostle. There's a chapter about that. So he's practically a Christ in his own right. The whole story is parallel. Then I remember I was doing a guest talk to a friend's Bible study group, and he wanted to discuss Nag Hammadi texts, and so he suggested the Apocalypse of Paul. There are 2 or 3 works with that title, but the Gnostic one. And I'm discussing it, and it suddenly dawns on me, there's no reference to Christ in this, not at all. Paul appears to be the Gnostic Redeemer. He ascends to heaven and he goes from one heaven to the next, and he's attacked by the archons and all that and defeats them. Where is Christ in all this? Nowhere. Is this a surviving text from a group that thought Paul was the Christ? sure kind of looks that way to me. I mean, it's very odd you don't even mention Jesus in a Christian thing. So I think there are hints that Paul was a Christ figure, and eventually it was subsumed into Christianity in exactly the same way the John the Baptist sect was. So you had to push people aside to make room for him. That Apollos must have been a real rival. Could he have been Apollonius of Tyana? I don't know, but in fact in the Western text it actually is Apollonius instead of Apollos. There's in Acts the story of Peter's miraculous escape when Herod Agrippa wanted to behead him, and he's in jail and he's chained to these guards. And then an angel comes and rescues him. Those chains fall off. He leaves the prison. The angel disappears. He goes to the house of John Mark, where all of his disciples are praying for him. He knocks on the door. The maid is stunned to see him, so shocked she doesn't know what to say. So the woman goes to the group and says, "It's Peter," and they doubt. They say, nah, it's his guardian angel. It's his ghost, in other words. And no, this is really him. That kind of looks like the Easter stories about Jesus, even down to the tomb guards. And was this a vestige of the Peter is the Christ cult? I don't know, but they point in a certain direction, and you got to wonder, are these little loose ends from earlier things that got absorbed into it? Let's see. So what was the question again? I've gone so far.
No, that's fascinating. I'd like to rabbit trail into that deeper, because you talked about Paul. Did he think himself a prophet, a Messiah, this and this and that? And I'm sure you're going to get to the prophet stuff here, or at least to some extent we're going to get into some of this. But I think it's fascinating. I could see how someone would try to explain this away and just say, no, the author, the writer tried to parallel Jesus. They're trying to...
Could be.
It could be. I just find this tradition thing, when you see something that's proven, or it seems... evident in prior cases, it makes a lot of sense, right? Why that could be the case here. Could it be a copy of? Sure. Could they be mimicking and making, Peter or Cephas look like Jesus, Paul look like
that's
Jesus?
Plausible.
Sure, but we know how late these gospel narratives do take place as well, and who to know which came first, chicken or the egg in this situation. But you brought up in a show one time, we talked about flood accounts. We talked about creation. You talked about there's 3 creation accounts. Well, there's also destruction accounts, plural, in the Old Testament. And form critics like yourself see this and go, listen, these are multiple traditions that they kept in this literature, and they compiled it. It's not like they threw it out. They utilized it, and maybe they adjusted to keep these traditions. It sounds to me like... why, and maybe we're hinging a lot of weight on that one passage, but are you of Paul, are you of Cephas, are you of Apollos, or are you of Christ? It makes sense to me. Why would you put a menu like that? So anyway.
It just seems to me, and when you look at the one story about Apollos in Acts, it's kind of confusing. He knows the things concerning Jesus accurately, and yet he knows only the baptism of John. So Priscilla and Aquila set him straight. What, was this guy a Christian or not? Or similarly, the adjacent story where Paul runs into the 12 disciples of John the Baptist, and they don't know about Jesus either, and Paul tells them and baptizes them. And this is in Ephesus, where John, son of Zebedee, kind of eventually replaced Paul as their patron saint. I'm not the first to suggest that this is supposed to be John, son of Zebedee, and the 12 are his fellow disciples of Jesus. It's kind of a wink to the reader. And so there's this, what's my line? Who's telling the truth here? And it's fun to try to graft these things into a coherent theory that admittedly is speculative. But that's not really a problem unless you have this secret dogmatic bias where you say, no, that's not good enough. I have to know if this is really Paul, because as Martin Luther said, Paul is really the authority for our beliefs. We don't really care that much what Jesus says, but Paul, I mean, he's really Martin Luther and so forth. That's the first time I went to the Jesus seminar. I said, it's interesting that you're willing to throw Jesus to the wolves. Did he really say this? They really do that? But with Paul, oh no, the lucky seven. That's because even liberal Protestants have this compass that says, Paul, once we isolate the lucky seven, that's the canon within the canon. And that's why they're Pauline apologists trying to say, oh, Paul was actually pro-Jewish, Paul was actually feminist, Paul was anarcho-syndicalist and an ecology buff and all. We got to use him as a ventriloquist dummy.
That's their foundation.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. Like, I'm listening to Christine Hayes and others, brilliant people, but they start with what they don't doubt that. Paul 7, it's it. And as long as we have that, we can formulate our theories of Christianity. We can formulate, and they build this massive castle on this, and they find Paul to be more Jewish. They find Paul to be, no, the reason why Gentiles weren't to be circumcised is because a Jewish idea, and like everything's so pro-Jewish. But what I see you're doing is you're saying, first of all, your foundation's shaky. Number two, this is probably patchwork. Number three, Paul is well, in my opinion, based on your opinion, I mean, is that there's too much second century stuff going on, and the real combat isn't first century stuff here. I can see stuff that looks like Marcionism, Gnosticism, and different variety of things that are going on in Pauline literature. Makes me think, hey, this is an evolution of thought. Whatever the proto was, we don't really know. Could it have been pro-Jewish all the way? Could it have been? We don't really know, and it's hard to pin down. And this is why I like having people like Rabbi Toby Singer come on, who are radical Orthodox Jews, who go, are you kidding me? A human sacrifice is the core belief of this system? And I could show you that God thinks a human sacrifice is an abomination, right? So, like, I'm not saying that, he's right or wrong in this. I'm making the point that it seems rather non-Jewish in many ways, too. So you can't just go, this is a perfect offshoot of Judaism. But one thing I wanted to mention that I think you were heading in, and I just wanted to take your mind there. Paul, he talked about, did he become an incarnation of Christ, right? Well, where you were going with your thinking that I thought was interesting was, you said there were prophets or people who believed they were the Christ who then give it away to someone else. Now, Paul could have thought he was the Christ and then handed it off, or the authors that touched these, like you said, they collect these things, they made Christ, they might have been Christ cult people, and they're the ones who won out in history. Yeah. And they said, we're going to make Paul, we're going to make Cephas, we're going to make all these other figures followers of the Christ. And now we have to edit and redact to make them hand over or appear to be subservient to the Christ. Yeah.
Just like John the Baptist was. Right. And that's not any radical theory except a fundamentalist. I mean, everybody kind of recognizes that when the people were wondering in their hearts, could John be the Christ? He said, hey, look, I'm not worthy to tie this guy's shoes. Like, that appears in Matthew, but not as an answer to suspicions that John might be the Christ. Luke has set that up to make it an answer to a question that wasn't asked in the original. And the thing with John the Baptist, hey, this guy's baptizing people and everybody's going over to him. And John says, what, are you worried about me? I'm happy he's succeeding. I only came to point out him to the masses and so forth. It's pretty obvious what they're trying to do. They're trying to co-opt him. Whereas other early Christians took the approach and said, your guy is a false prophet. He's an antichrist. Well, not everybody did that. And in the same way, there were Jewish Christians that thought Paul was the Antichrist. And it's no surprise. The same sort of nonsense goes on today. Are there any mentions in the so-called Pauline epistles that would back up the idea that Paul thought he was an incarnation? I would say not quite, but there's something approaching that when he says that God revealed his Son in me. That's interesting. Or to me, you could translate it either way. But if it's in me, that, and then you think of in Second Corinthians, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that even though we get knocked down and dragged out, we persist, we keep going, so that people will see it's Christ's life in us, me, and it's not just my resources. And that's sort of like saying I am a living epiphany of Christ. Pannenberg mentions, I don't know where he gets this, but he says that an early Syrian Christology was what he calls an epiphany Christology, that Jesus is revealed or that the Son of God or whatever is revealed in Jesus, so that it's not exactly him, but he is the medium for the revelation of Christ. That's kind of what Baha'u'llah was supposed to be. He's not an incarnation of Allah. He's the point of manifestation, they say. So if you want to see God, go to him, but they don't go so far as to say, yeah, he's an incarnation. Though other Muslims, well, this is hundreds of years before, said that Ali, the cousin, I guess is the nephew and adopted son of Muhammad, that he was Allah incarnate, which is astounding that any Muslims would say that, but he was so high in their estimation that they thought he was God, and that as a man on earth, he was docetic, that he wasn't even really flesh and blood. It's so fascinating. All these groups and how they evolve along the same trajectory once they hit the same problem, and there are only so many ways of dealing with it, and you'll see somebody proposing one of the answers, maybe groups with all of them.